If you're planning a move to Ottawa, it can be really hard to get a good idea of what living here is actually like. Most of what you find online covers the obvious things like the weather, government jobs, neighborhoods, but not the more specific things that you start noticing once you actually live here. I had already lived in Montreal and Vancouver before we moved, so there were quite a few things about Ottawa that really just stood out to me pretty quickly. So here are 8 specific things I noticed not long after we relocated to Ottawa, starting in no particular order. Ottawa's newer suburbs really like roundabouts. We do not have the same maze of overpasses and highway ramps that I remember from Montreal, but Ottawa's newer suburbs really love roundabouts. In some areas, you can go through several of them during just one really short drive. Most of the single lane ones are easy enough, I would say, but it's where the 2-lane roundabouts are where everyone suddenly seems to kind of follow their own set of rules. So if roundabouts are new to you and you are moving to Ottawa, it may be worth just quickly brushing up on some of those rules because you will probably come across them much more often than you are used to, especially in some of the newer suburban areas. And I can almost promise that no matter which neighborhood you move into, the local Facebook group will eventually have a very angry post about people who still do not know how to use the roundabout. So not a lot of people know this, especially when you type Ottawa on, Google Maps. It really doesn't seem all that big, but Ottawa is actually one of the largest major cities in Canada by land size. It actually covers almost 2,800 square kilometers, which is more than 4 times the size of Toronto and about 24 times the size of Vancouver. A big reason for that is Ottawa's 2001 amalgamation. So the city joined together with places like Canada, Nepean, Gloucester, and several nearby townships. And that is exactly why Ottawa now includes busy suburbs, small villages, farmlands, and even some very rural areas. So someone can say they live in Ottawa, and that could mean a downtown apartment, a townhouse in Canada, or a very rural property near Manotick with, a well, septic system, and barely any other house in sight. East End and West End residents act as though they live in entirely different cities. So if you live in either the West End or the East End of Ottawa, you probably won't know much about the opposite end. And I don't know really why that is, but it's actually fairly common. If you live in Orleans, for example, you are rarely going to make it out to the West End of Ottawa unless maybe you're here for something, a very specific reason, like the outlet mall. I live in the West End, and we recently had my daughter's birthday party in the East End, and at least half of the guests, I would say, said some version or form of, "Oh, I've never been out here." And that is such an Ottawa thing. Once your, work, school, friends, activities are all kind of concentrated on one side, the opposite end starts to feel surprisingly far away. The Greenbelt here actually creates gaps between the different parts of the city. So some of Ottawa's neighborhoods are not necessarily tightly connected to one another. So you can leave one really busy area and drive through farmland or forest or some very quiet rural roads and then suddenly arrive in a very large, suburb. And if you are unfamiliar with Ottawa, this can honestly make you wonder, am I still going the right way? It can feel like you're leaving the city and heading somewhere completely different. It's happened to me a couple of times when we first moved here. And, even though you technically still are in Ottawa. A big reason for this is the Greenbelt. So the Greenbelt is a very large protected area around the older part of the city, and it covers about 200 square kilometers. So because of it, Ottawa does not grow in one continuous stretch in every direction. There are actual real gaps between some of the neighborhoods and suburbs, and this explains why places like Canada or Barrhaven in Orleans can feel separate from central Ottawa and even from each other. You can leave one developed area, drive through open land for a while, and then find yourself back in another part of the city. Something else unique to Ottawa is you can cross one bridge and enter an entirely different province. One thing that feels very different about Ottawa is how closely connected it is to Gatineau. And even though Gatineau is in Quebec, you can be in downtown Ottawa, cross the river, and within a few minutes, you are in another province. There are actually 5 bridges connecting Ottawa and Gatineau, so crossing back and forth is almost really just a normal part of life here. It's extremely common as well for someone to live in Gatineau and work in Ottawa, or to live in Ottawa and work on the Quebec side. For a lot of people, crossing into another province is simply just, their regular drive to work. Actually, Statistics Canada's latest full census counted more than 31,000 Ottawa-Gatineau residents commuting to a different province for work. So when you're driving around, it can feel like Ottawa and Gatineau are 2 parts of the same general area. But if you are thinking about living on the other side of the river, it is important to remember that Gatineau is not just another Ottawa neighborhood. You would be living in Quebec. So, things like taxes and healthcare and schools and buying a home obviously would work differently there. Still, it is pretty unique that you can cross a bridge, enter another province, and barely feel like you have even left the city. One thing people constantly say about Ottawa is that it has a great sense of community, but I find that phrase gets used so often that it barely means anything anymore. So what does that actually look like? In my opinion, in Ottawa, I can find it very literal almost. You can live in Stittsville, but then within Stittsville, the smaller pocket you live in may have its own, events and volunteers and little ways for the neighbors to get together. If you look at Fairwinds, for example, they have front porch concerts and other local activities. Another part of the neighborhood might organize a Canada Day block party, maybe a community garage sale where everybody has a garage sale on the exact same day. There could be a seasonal event or a neighborhood cleanup. In a lot of areas, parents and volunteers will also come together to build and take care of, an outdoor rink at the local park during winter, for example. So you're not only living in Stittsville, you're living in a very much, smaller community inside Stittsville, and that little pocket can almost have its own calendar. And when I lived in Montreal, I felt as though the events were more connected to downtown or even, a larger area. And in Vancouver, I noticed more activities tied to larger neighborhoods or, community centers. Ottawa feels different to me because it is so spread out. And a lot of the events and activities happen inside these smaller little residential areas, and they're planned by the people who actually live there. So of course, this is not, every street or every neighborhood across Ottawa. A lot of it depends on whether there are active volunteers who are willing to even organize things like this. But Ottawa was one of the first places where the phrase sense of community had, a real meaning to me. Registering your kids for activities can feel like you're buying Taylor Swift concert tickets. Something I did not expect about raising kids in Ottawa is that you do not casually remember to register them for swimming 3 days later. You know the registration date, you have your account ready, you know which community centers you're willing to drive to. And when registration opens, it can feel like you were trying to get Taylor Swift concert tickets. Ottawa has so many community centers and, great city programs, which is great, it's fantastic, but the programs closest to your house or at the best times can fill up so fast. So when you do move here with kids, one of the first things I would do is figure out which recreation centers are actually near you and pay attention close to when registration does open up. And of course, if you are living in Ottawa, I would say swimming lessons here are pretty necessary, which leads me to my last point. Ottawa is far more swimmable than it seems. After living in Vancouver for 10 years about and having easy access to the ocean, I can honestly say that we swim more here in Ottawa than we ever did in Vancouver. Even in the middle of summer, the ocean was usually just way too cold for me to really enjoy. And I loved being near it, don't get me wrong, but actually getting in and swimming was a different story. In Ottawa, we have the Ottawa River and several lakes nearby, and where the water is much easier to swim in. It's freshwater temperature. There are city beaches, there are smaller lakes, there's conservation areas, and even some places that feel more like a cottage swimming spot, all within a very reasonable drive. And lately, there have also been more places added along the Ottawa River for swimming. So we now have, more swimming docks, the NCC River House, and several areas where people can sit by the water or, go for a quick swim. There are plenty of places to rent a kayak or a canoe, join a paddling club, take sailing lessons, or just spend an afternoon on the water. Ottawa is usually known for just government and, winter and being boring, but it's actually a very active city when it comes to any kind of sort of water activity. That was one of the biggest surprises for me after moving here. Wasn't expecting it.